Stop scrolling for a moment. I'm serious. Just pause. Because if this video appeared on your screen right now, at this exact second, something very unusual has already happened. Think about it, out of billions of videos, billions of signals moving through the internet every second, somehow this message reached you. And the strange part is that many people will scroll right past it without feeling anything at all. But you didn't. Something in you hesitated. Maybe it was subtle, just a quiet pause before your thumb moved. That pause matters more than you realize. In ancient Hermetic philosophy, moments like this were called recognition points, tiny intersections in time when awareness suddenly becomes aware of itself. The ancient wisdom keepers believed that consciousness sends signals to itself when a person reaches a certain threshold of perception. They described this force as Sophia, the living intelligence of wisdom itself. Not a person, not a myth, but a principle of awareness that recognizes readiness. And according to those teachings, Sophia does not broadcast messages randomly. It responds when a mind becomes capable of hearing something deeper than noise. If that sounds strange, stay with me for a moment, because what we're about to explore isn't mystical fantasy. It's the intersection of ancient Hermetic philosophy, consciousness research, and the psychology of recognition. And here is the most important part. In the ancient mystery schools, teachers believed that the moment of recognition can only happen once in the same way. Once awareness sees itself clearly, it can never fully return to the state it was in before. So if you're here right now, the question is not whether this message found you, the real question is why. Before we go deeper, take 1 second to support the channel. If this message resonates with you even slightly, press the like button so YouTube knows this kind of content matters. And if you're interested in ancient wisdom, Hermetic philosophy, consciousness, and hidden knowledge, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss future transmissions like this. Also, I want to ask you something simple but important. Comment below and tell me which part of the United States, or the world, are you watching from. Seeing where everyone is watching from creates an incredible map of consciousness seekers around the world. Now let's continue. To understand why the idea of Sophia choosing someone appears in so many ancient teachings, we have to begin with something most modern discussions of spirituality overlook: the structure of awareness itself. In everyday life, we assume consciousness is simply the experience of thoughts, emotions, and sensory information passing through the mind. We wake up, we perceive the world, we react, and we assume that this stream of mental activity is what it means to be conscious. But philosophers, neuroscientists, and ancient Hermetic scholars have all pointed toward a deeper layer hidden beneath that activity. They observed that awareness is not merely the content of thoughts, it is the space in which those thoughts appear. And once you start examining that distinction carefully, something fascinating begins to happen. You realize that the mind is capable of observing its own processes. In psychology, this is called meta-awareness, the ability of consciousness to notice itself operating. It sounds simple, but it represents one of the most profound thresholds in human cognition. The ancient Hermetic traditions described this threshold using symbolic language. Instead of speaking about neural patterns or cognitive feedback loops, they spoke about Sophia, the intelligence of wisdom, recognizing a mind that had become capable of perceiving its own awareness. In their view, Sophia was not a distant goddess selecting individuals arbitrarily. Rather, Sophia symbolized the moment when wisdom emerges naturally from perception itself. When someone becomes capable of noticing the architecture of their own mind, wisdom begins to arise automatically because perception becomes clearer. This idea appears repeatedly in Hermetic writings attributed to figures like Thoth or Hermes Trismegistus. They taught that most human beings live in a state of reactive awareness. Stimulus appears, reaction follows, and meaning is constructed afterward. But a small number of people eventually experience a shift where perception becomes less reactive and more observational. Instead of being pulled entirely by every thought or emotion, they begin to witness those mental movements. That shift marks the beginning of what the mystery schools called initiation. Not an external ceremony, but a transformation in how awareness functions internally. When we translate that ancient symbolism into modern language, we begin to see striking parallels with current research on attention and consciousness. Neuroscientists studying attention networks have found that the brain contains systems designed specifically for monitoring its own cognitive activity. These systems, particularly in the prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex, allow individuals to step back from automatic reactions and observe their mental patterns. In other words, the brain is literally built with the capacity for self-recognition. What the Hermetic teachers described metaphorically as Sophia recognizing a mind may actually correspond to the activation of these reflective awareness systems. But ancient teachers added another dimension to this idea. They believed that when a person begins to observe their own mind clearly, the search for external validation gradually weakens. Instead of constantly looking outward for confirmation of truth, meaning begins to emerge directly from perception. This is what the Hermetic texts often called gnosis, direct knowing. Gnosis was not considered mystical knowledge delivered from outside. It was the clarity that arises when awareness becomes stable enough to see patterns without distortion. When that clarity appears, something interesting happens psychologically. The endless cycle of seeking begins to slow down. For many people, life becomes a continuous search for the next answer, the next explanation, the next external authority that promises certainty. But the Hermetic philosophers argued that once awareness recognizes its own structure, the need for constant seeking gradually dissolves, not because questions disappear, but because perception becomes strong enough to observe reality directly. In modern cognitive science, this shift resembles what researchers call attentional stabilization. When attention becomes steady, the mind processes information more coherently, and internal noise decreases. That is why people who develop strong awareness practices often describe a sense of quiet clarity emerging in their thinking. The ancient teachers interpreted that quiet clarity as the presence of Sophia, wisdom manifesting through perception. This brings us to the idea of the emerald frequency mentioned in many modern interpretations of Hermetic symbolism. In literal terms, there is no scientific evidence that the human mind emits a specific emerald-colored vibration associated with awakening. However, the symbolism of the emerald color appears throughout Hermetic literature, especially in the legendary emerald tablet attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. The emerald symbol represented clarity, balance, and the alignment of perception with truth. When people today speak about an emerald frequency activating within consciousness, they are often referring symbolically to the emergence of coherent awareness, the moment when mental fragmentation begins to organize into clearer perception. And here is where things become especially interesting. When awareness becomes coherent, perception begins noticing patterns that previously went unnoticed. Humans are pattern detection machines. Our brains constantly analyze relationships between events, but most of the time we interpret those patterns through existing beliefs and expectations. When awareness becomes more stable, however, pattern recognition becomes less distorted by emotional reaction. This can create the feeling that synchronicities are appearing everywhere. Numbers like 1111, repeated coincidences, unexpected connections between events. These experiences often occur when the mind becomes more attentive to subtle relationships in the environment. Whether one interprets those patterns spiritually or psychologically, the underlying mechanism involves heightened awareness and attention. Ancient Hermetic teachers believed that these moments of pattern recognition were signals encouraging deeper observation. They taught that awareness itself communicates through symbols, not necessarily because the universe is sending coded messages, but because perception becomes capable of detecting meaning in ways it previously ignored. When someone begins noticing these signals, the experience can feel almost like being called towards something unknown. But the Hermetic tradition offered an important warning: recognition alone is not the final stage of awakening. It is only the beginning. Many people encounter moments of heightened awareness and assume they have reached the ultimate truth. In reality, the first recognition simply opens the door to deeper observation. Once the mind becomes aware of its own structure, it begins noticing how easily perception can still become distorted by assumptions, fears, and expectations. This is why the mystery schools emphasize discipline and awareness. Initiates were taught to observe their thoughts carefully, to question interpretations, and to remain curious rather than dogmatic. Wisdom, according to their teachings, grows through continuous observation rather than fixed belief. When we examine these teachings through a modern lens, we see that they align closely with the principles of cognitive flexibility and metacognition studied in psychology today. People who cultivate strong metacognitive awareness, meaning the ability to think about their own thinking, tend to make more balanced decisions and adapt more effectively to complex situations. In a sense, what the Hermetic tradition called Sophia awakening within the mind could be interpreted as the development of advanced cognitive awareness. So when someone says that Sophia chose them, the deeper interpretation might be simpler and more profound at the same time. It may mean that their awareness reached a point where it began recognizing its own patterns, its own architecture, its own ability to observe itself. And once that recognition happens, life begins to feel different, not necessarily dramatic or supernatural, but subtly clearer. Decisions may become less reactive. Thoughts may become easier to observe, and the constant search for external validation may begin to quiet down. In that quiet space, wisdom can start to appear naturally. The Hermetic teachers believed that this was the true initiation into the mystery school, not an external ceremony, but the moment when awareness becomes capable of recognizing itself as the source of perception. That recognition, they said, is the beginning of genuine understanding. And once someone reaches that point, they are no longer simply reacting to the world around them. They begin participating consciously in the unfolding of their own awareness. In other words, the moment Sophia chooses, someone may actually be the moment when a person finally becomes capable of choosing awareness itself. Once the mind begins to experience the first moment of genuine recognition, when awareness becomes aware of itself, the next phase of the journey begins quietly, almost imperceptibly. This stage is often misunderstood because people expect awakening to feel dramatic, overwhelming, or mystical in a way that immediately transforms everything overnight. Ancient Hermetic teachings, however, describe something far more subtle and far more profound. They explain that after the initial recognition, the mind slowly begins to reorganize how it perceives reality. The ancient teachers referred to this process as the awakening of inner wisdom, but what they were describing closely resembles what modern psychology would call a shift in cognitive architecture. Instead of reacting automatically to every thought and emotion, the mind gradually develops a new relationship with its own activity. Thoughts are no longer commands that must be obeyed immediately. They become signals that can be observed, evaluated, and understood. This transformation may appear small on the surface, but its implications are enormous because it changes the entire foundation of how perception works. When awareness begins observing itself, the internal noise that once dominated attention slowly loses its authority. The endless stream of mental commentary that once felt unavoidable becomes easier to step back from. At first, this happens only occasionally. You might notice a moment where you catch a thought forming before it fully takes over your attention. You might suddenly realize that a reaction you were about to express no longer feels necessary. These brief moments of clarity are what the Hermetic philosophers called the signals of Sophia beginning to operate within the mind. They believe that wisdom does not arrive as external information but emerges naturally when perception becomes stable enough to see reality clearly. In other words, wisdom is not something added to the mind, it is something revealed when distortion begins to fade. This idea appears repeatedly in the writings associated with the Hermetic tradition. The teachers described human perception as a mirror. When the mirror is covered with dust, representing fear, belief, and unconscious reaction, it reflects the world inaccurately. But when the mirror is cleaned through observation and awareness, reflection becomes clear. The clarity itself is wisdom. When we translate that metaphor into modern understanding, we begin to see how closely it aligns with contemporary studies of attention and cognitive bias. Our brains constantly filter reality through expectations, emotional conditioning, and learned assumptions. These filters help us navigate the world quickly, but they also distort perception. When awareness strengthens, these filters become easier to notice. Instead of unconsciously believing every interpretation produced by the mind, a person begins to see that interpretation itself as a process, and once interpretation becomes visible, it becomes possible to question it. This is one of the most powerful changes that occurs after the initial recognition stage. The mind begins shifting from automatic interpretation to conscious observation. Ancient teachers described this as the movement from reaction to awareness. Reaction happens instantly, without examination. Awareness introduces space between stimulus and response. In that space, perception can reorganize itself. This space is where genuine choice begins to exist. The Hermetic tradition placed enormous importance on this transition because they believed it marked the beginning of true freedom of consciousness. As long as a person reacts automatically to every mental impulse, their awareness is essentially being directed by unconscious patterns. But once observation appears, the mind begins reclaiming its ability to direct attention intentionally. In modern neuroscience, this ability is often associated with the strengthening of executive control networks in the brain. These networks allow individuals to regulate attention, pause before reacting, and choose responses more deliberately. What the ancient teachers symbolized as Sophia guiding the awakening mind may correspond to the gradual strengthening of these reflective awareness systems. But the Hermetic teachings also described another phenomenon that often emerges during this stage: an increased sensitivity to patterns and meaning. When attention becomes clearer, the mind begins noticing relationships that previously passed unnoticed. Events that once felt random may begin to appear interconnected. Many people describe this phase as a period filled with synchronicities, moments when circumstances align in ways that seem unusually meaningful. From a psychological perspective, this can be explained partly by heightened awareness of patterns. When attention becomes more focused, the brain naturally detects relationships between events more easily. But the Hermetic philosophers believed something deeper was also occurring. They suggested that when awareness becomes more coherent, a person's perception aligns more closely with the underlying structure of reality itself. In their view, the universe operates according to patterns of order and intelligence, and when the mind becomes clear enough, those patterns become visible. Whether one interprets this idea spiritually or metaphorically, the experience of noticing meaningful patterns often encourages deeper reflection. Instead of assuming that life is purely chaotic, individuals begin considering the possibility that awareness itself participates in shaping perception. This brings us to the idea of consciousness as a participatory process. In many ancient traditions, consciousness was not viewed as a passive observer of reality, but as an active participant in it. Perception influences interpretation, interpretation influences behavior, and behavior influences the environment. In this way, awareness continuously interacts with the world around it. Modern cognitive science echoes a similar perspective through the concept of predictive processing. According to this theory, the brain constantly generates predictions about reality based on past experience. These predictions shape what we notice and how we interpret sensory information. When awareness strengthens, people become better at recognizing these predictive patterns and adjusting them when necessary. This flexibility allows perception to become more accurate over time. The Hermetic teachers believed that developing this flexibility was essential for genuine wisdom. Without it, the mind becomes trapped in rigid belief systems that prevent learning and growth. They warn that one of the greatest obstacles on the path of awareness is the temptation to replace old beliefs with new ones that feel equally absolute. True wisdom, they said, does not cling to fixed conclusions but remains open to continuous discovery. This attitude of curiosity and observation forms the foundation of what they called the mystery school path. Contrary to popular imagination, the mystery schools were not secret societies devoted to hidden rituals alone. Their primary focus was the cultivation of awareness. Students were trained to observe their thoughts, question their assumptions, and develop clarity of perception. Over time, this practice allowed them to recognize patterns in nature, human behavior, and their own consciousness. The goal was not to accumulate knowledge, but to refine perception until wisdom emerged naturally from experience. One of the most intriguing aspects of these teachings is the emphasis placed on timing. The Hermetic philosophers believed that moments of recognition appear only when a person is ready to perceive them. They described awareness as moving through stages of development, much like learning any complex skill. Just as a student cannot understand advanced mathematics without first learning basic concepts, a mind cannot perceive deeper patterns in reality without first developing stability and attention. This is why many teachings suggest that certain messages or insights appear precisely when someone becomes capable of understanding them. When people say that Sophia chose them, it may reflect this experience of encountering an idea or realization at exactly the moment it becomes meaningful. In reality, the message may have existed long before, but perception was not ready to recognize its significance until that point. This idea highlights something important about the nature of learning and awakening. Growth rarely occurs through sudden external revelation alone. It happens through gradual preparation within the mind itself. Each experience, question, and moment of reflection contributes to the development of awareness. Eventually, these elements combine to create a threshold of understanding. When that threshold is crossed, Recognition occurs naturally. From the outside, it may look like coincidence or destiny. From the inside, it feels like clarity finally emerging after a long period of searching. As this process continues, the relationship between the mind and its thoughts becomes increasingly balanced. Instead of identifying completely with every mental narrative, a person begins seeing thoughts as temporary formations within awareness. This shift can dramatically reduce the intensity of emotional reactions because the mind no longer treats every interpretation as absolute truth. Emotions still arise, but they pass through awareness more fluidly instead of becoming overwhelming. This emotional balance was considered one of the key signs of awakening in the Hermetic tradition. The teachers emphasized that genuine wisdom does not create superiority or detachment from life. Instead, it produces a deeper sense of clarity and compassion. When the mind is no longer dominated by unconscious reactions, it becomes easier to understand others and respond thoughtfully rather than defensively. In this way, awareness does not remove a person from the world. It allows them to participate more consciously within it. This is why the Hermetic path always emphasized integration rather than escape. Awakening was not about abandoning ordinary life, but about experiencing it with greater clarity. Every interaction, challenge, and decision became an opportunity to observe how awareness functions. Over time, this continuous observation refines perception further and further. The mind becomes quieter, more focused, and more capable of recognizing subtle patterns within experience. And it is during this stage that many people begin to sense something remarkable, the realization that awareness itself may be far deeper and more expansive than previously imagined. The Hermetic philosophers suggested that human consciousness is not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a much larger field of intelligence. They described this field symbolically through ideas such as the 9 dimensions of consciousness or the universal mind. While these concepts are often interpreted mystically, they may also represent attempts to describe the layered complexity of awareness. Modern research into consciousness increasingly suggests that perception emerges from interactions between multiple neural systems rather than a single central point. The brain operates as a network of networks, constantly integrating information from different sources. When awareness becomes more coherent, these networks may synchronize more effectively, creating a sense of expanded clarity. In ancient language, this synchronization could be interpreted as higher dimensions of awareness activating within the mind. Whether one views these ideas metaphorically or literally, the experience they describe is consistent across many traditions. As awareness stabilizes, perception becomes less fragmented and more unified. Thoughts, emotions, and sensory experiences begin to feel like interconnected aspects of a single process rather than separate forces competing for attention. This unity creates a sense of inner coherence that many people describe as alignment with purpose or meaning. The Hermetic teachers believe that this alignment is the natural result of awareness functioning clearly. When the mind is no longer dominated by confusion and unconscious reaction, it becomes easier to recognize what truly matters. Decisions become guided by understanding rather than impulse. Actions become expressions of clarity rather than attempts to escape uncertainty. In this sense, the awakening of Sophia within consciousness is not about acquiring mystical powers or secret knowledge. It is about rediscovering the natural intelligence already present within awareness itself. The more clearly the mind observes its own processes, the more this intelligence becomes visible. And once it becomes visible, it begins guiding perception naturally toward greater understanding. This quiet guidance is what the ancient teachers meant when they said that wisdom begins speaking from within. It is not a voice or message appearing from outside the mind. It is the clarity that emerges when awareness finally learns how to observe itself. Now that recognition has awakened within you. The final stage is about integration, bringing the clarity of awareness into every aspect of your life. The Hermetic tradition emphasized that awakening is not complete until perception, thought, emotion, and action align with the intelligence of Sophia. This means observing your inner patterns, noticing synchronicities, and responding to reality from a place of calm clarity rather than reaction. Your emerald frequency, the symbolic resonance of coherent consciousness, begins to harmonize your mind with your surroundings, allowing subtle signals, timing, and alignment to appear naturally. Everyday moments that once felt random now carry meaning, and decisions are guided by insight rather than impulse. This stage is subtle but profound as awareness integrates fully. You experience a continuous connection to higher, order intelligence, a sense of inner guidance that arises spontaneously when the mind is quiet and receptive. The Hermetic teachers stress that this integration is lifelong. Wisdom grows incrementally as awareness remains vigilant. Even as challenges and distractions appear, you retain the capacity to recognize patterns, maintain coherence, and respond intentionally. Practically, this means noticing recurring numbers like 1111, sensing synchronicities, and feeling aligned with your soul purpose, signs that your consciousness has stabilized into a state capable of self-recognition. This is why the activation moment is unique. It occurs precisely when your mind is ready, never repeating in the same way. From this point forward, your life unfolds in closer alignment with your true path, guided by the quiet, persistent influence of Sophia. Every thought, choice, and perception can now reflect conscious participation in your awakening, creating opportunities for growth, manifestation, and understanding that were previously inaccessible. Integration is not mystical. It is the natural maturation of awareness. The mind that observes itself consistently begins to act intentionally, and this intentionality creates real transformation. Recognize it, honor it, and participate consciously in this ongoing activation. Sophia has found you at the exact moment your consciousness is prepared to awaken, and now the responsibility and the privilege is yours to align fully, to live from this deeper state of coherent awareness, and to allow your emerald frequency to resonate through every dimension of your life.